About now.
Looking good.
Great. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to talk about Devil's Hole and its ecosystem. It is one of my passions, and I've spent a considerable part of my career in the conservation recovery efforts for this species. So Devil's Hole, the top photo there shows a view from the observation deck. So it's about 50 feet above where the water surface is. I'd like to call it a window into the aquifer or into the groundwater. So it's a water-filled cavern. And that cross-section below is turned 90 degrees to your left. And it just shows how deep Devil's Hole is. It's actually, divers have been down to 436 feet and did not see a bottom. So it's unknown depth. Devil's Hole is part of Death Valley National Park, and it's located about 50 miles east of park headquarters, that is in Furnace Creek. So Devil's Hole is known for its extreme condition. It's warm. It's 33.5 to 34 degrees Celsius, which is about 93 degrees Fahrenheit, so bath water. It has very low dissolved oxygen, 2.5 to 3 milligrams per liter. What does that mean? Typically, your desert springs and ash meadows and in other desert biomes, the dissolved oxygen would be 8, 10, 12 milligrams per liter. So it's very low in oxygen. And those two conditions, the temperature and DO that I'm explaining, are constant in the deep pool. And the deep pool is that darker area to the top of those two photos. And then that green area, and then with a bunch of algae, and then with algae removed, is the shallow shelf. So I'll be talking about those two main habitats within Devil's Hole. So Devil's Hole is also high in calcium carbonate because it's located in limestone rock. The system is also energy limited. This slide shows that in the summer you have algae. In the winter, you do not. And there's fluctuations over the shallow shelf. So there's an intertidal zone, I like to say, in that the water level follows the lunar tidal cycle. It has 2 peaks and 2 troughs in about a 24-hour period. And that is due to the large volume of water. Again, we're looking into that lower carbonate aquifer. So the Devil's Hole pupfish, it was listed under the Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1966. It was actually listed in 67 the following year. And then, I don't like to say grandfathered, but it was, added into the Endangered Species Act that we know of today of 1973. It's a small, shallow-bodied fish. It lacks pelvic fins, and it has reduced activity and regression. And the idea is that if you're in a kind of a system that doesn't have a lot of current for most of the time, you don't need to put the energy into growing the pelvic fins. Use it to reproduce. So the Devil's Hole pupfish spawn and feed on that shallow shelf predominantly, though we do see them down at depth, a couple down at 70 or 80 feet. And the shelf size is about 2.5 meters in width by 5.5 meters in length. And the mean depth is about 36 centimeters. There's deeper portions, 80 centimeters, and shallower portions, 5 to 10 centimeters. What's also unique for pupfishes in general, but Devil's Hole pupfish as well, is they lay 1 egg each per spawning event, but the females can lay multiple eggs over time. Also, the Devil's Hole pupfish is an annual fish, so it lives about 18 to 14 months in the wild. So they have to grow up in a hurry and reproduce. So Devil's Hole lives possibly in the most restricted habitat of a vertebrate species that we know on the planet. Again, that small opening, and they're typically, majority of the fish are found in the top 25 feet or so. So it also lives life on the edge of its physiological tolerances. And I explain the high temperature and low oxygen, and I'll explain in more detail the food limitation here shortly. It's also called a neotenous form, and its small size is indicative of life on the edge. And neotenous means you have very large eyes compared to your body size. The Devil's Hole pupfish, an adult, is probably about a little bit larger than your thumbnail, about an inch or so. So ecosystem constraints. So solar radiation, or sun that reaches the shallow shelf in the ecosystem, plays a critical role in the food web. So on the x-axis here on this figure is months of the year, And along the y-axis, you have solar radiation in micromoles per meter squared per second. So sunlight does not reach the shallow shelf from late fall through winter and through early spring. And then you can see the peak there in June, a maximum of about 4.5 hours of sunlight. So that really drives the ecosystem. So for food resources for the fish, in winter, it's a terrestrial-driven carbon food web, or we call that allochthonous carbon for the fancy term. In the summer, it's an algal-driven by primary production or autochthonous or within carbon-driven food web or ecosystem, which is really unique. So disturbances also play an important role in ecosystem function. So with floods, we have water overland flow that comes in and deposits fine silts. Depending on the magnitude, it could be large cobble, a lot of organic matter. So there's a short-term negative impact by smothering recently laid pupfish eggs or newly hatched fish that can't swim that well, but the adults know and they're able to swim over into the deep pool. And so there's also a long-term positive outcome in that it gives the ecosystem a pulse of much needed energy. This system, devil's hole, is typically considered a ligotrophic. It's a limnological term, which means a lack of energy. It's a very energy poor system. Now, another natural phenomenon, earthquakes also help structure. Here's a photograph of the shallow shelf pre-earthquake, and then a photograph post-earthquake. So what earthquakes do, if over time, say a year, 2 years, 3 years, the algae that dies, the carbon, the terrestrial carbon, the branches and leaves start dying and senescing, it can create anoxic or oxygen poor areas. And so if pupfish lay their eggs in these areas of low oxygen, they may not hatch. So earthquakes can reset the system. Again, a short-term negative impact, those eggs and small fish that can't swim are washed away and might not hatch or survive, but it has a long-term positive impact in that it kind of resets the ecosystem. So kind of a roadmap through the rest of my talk. I'm going to kind of give you a legislative and early management history, talk about the history of past, present, and the future, the management of devil's hole. It's somewhat unique, and then talk about a couple of applied research projects that we have, and also our long-term monitoring, which is part of our basic research. And then I'll finish up with our recent pupfish population estimates. So early management history, these two photographs are taken at about 70 feet in devil's hole, looking towards the surface. So you can see how clear and pristine the ecosystem is. You can see the divers there on the right photo, and then on the left, there's a dive liner that you can see towards the opening. Beautiful place to dive. So the devil's hole pupfish was first described by Joseph Wells in 1930. So it actually received its name on that in 1930. We'll fast forward to 1952. President Truman added, let me hide that, added 40 acres surrounding Devil's Hole to Death Valley National Monument. It was a monument then, by presidential proclamation. And in that language of the proclamation, thus said pool, Devil's Hole is of such outstanding scientific importance that it should be given special protection, evidenced by the presence in the pool of a peculiar race of desert fish. And this is important when we get to the water rights here in a little bit. So the further protection, I mentioned it was added to the Endangered Species Preservation Act. And the reason for this was local groundwater pumping. So in the late 60s, a private company, the Caperts, put a well in, and that's the circle up to the middle left, right along the boundary of Death Valley National Monument. And that below red circle shows Devil's Hole, a little bit of the observation deck, but you can see how Devil's Hole is located below the land surface. And when they did this, you see a photograph from 1950 and a photograph from 1973. The shallow shelf was pretty much dewatered. Here, probably about 60% of the shelf has been dewatered. It actually gets worse. And so in that response, when Okay, so we have along the x-axis, we have date from 1963 to 2007. And along the y-axis, we have both water level in red, the red line, and then pupfish numbers in the black line. So this just shows you that when the water level declined, the population of pupfish declined. And when the water level after pumping was reduced, started to increase and cover the shelf again, the pupfish responded. And I'll talk more to that black line that's showing it very low to the right later on. So in response to the dewatering of the shallow shelf, there was a public conservation activist movement, and that is in the form of the Desert Fishes Council. And Phil Peaster, a long time and the only secretary of the Desert Fishes Council, he recently passed back in 2023. We did realize, however, that species extension would precede implementation of any agency-sponsored preservation program if we were to follow the normal bureaucratic course. Phil Peaster was a famous conservationist for the desert and the Sierra Nevadas. And the federal response was developing a federal desert pupfish task force to consider conservation strategies. And some of these were to start off-site populations in different refuges. So the photograph on the bottom is a refuge that was built below Hoover Dam. You can kind of see it behind the individuals there. It's a little bit washed out, but that's down below Hoover Dam. So no access to the public, a safe place to have a backup population. The photograph to the right, you can see an apparatus over the deep pool. That is an artificial installation or artificial shelf to kind of mimic the shallow shelf that was being dewatered. And they actually added light to stimulate algal growth. And I'll talk about the type of light bulbs they used in a little bit. So some other past refuge sites, I showed you Hoover Dam. There was also in 1972, they brought some devil's hole pupfish to Grapevine Springs, which is below Scotty's Castle. They also built two structures in Ash Meadows, one in 1980 near School Springs, and then Point of Rocks in 1990. Ultimately, all of these refuges failed, mainly due to not having the staffing. A pump would fail that was delivering water, it'd get too hot, too cold, and they didn't continue the movement of fish from Devil's Hole to these different refuges while they had fish, so the fish started to change. They became more aggressive, they became larger, and in some cases, they started to show growth of pelvic fins. So they weren't a true Devil's Hole pupfish under the constraints of high temperature, low oxygen, and food limitation. Currently, I'm not going to talk about this today. There is the Ash Meadows Fish Conservation Facility that does have a 100,000-gallon tank that mimics the morphology of the shelf, a deeper pool of 22 feet, and not quite as hot. We call it Devil's Hole Light, and a little bit more oxygen, but they have a reproducing population of over 300 pupfish in our backup fish facility that is run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So to the water rights. So in 1976, the water issues went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court voted unanimously in favor of the U.S. or in favor of the NPS has water rights sufficient to maintain the level of the pool to preserve its scientific value. Also from the Capert versus U.S. 1976 federal filing, when the federal government reserves land, by implication, it reserves water rights sufficient to accomplish the purposes of the reservation. So the language that was put into the 1952 presidential proclamation that was written by two famous desert fish biologists or ichthyologists, Robert Rushmiller, and I always forget the other one, I'll think of it in a little bit. It was really forethinking in that the language in it forced the Supreme Court that was very conservative to vote in favor of the NPS water right. So further protection, Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge was established in 1984. There was a nice 40-year celebration earlier this year with some of the early researchers and those involved in making this happen. The Nature Conservancy bought most of the private land and gave it to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that was a great win. Okay, just to kind of summarize this part, and what I want to talk about here it's been observed Endangered Species Act, groundwater pumping, Supreme Court decision. But you can see there on the left of the light bulbs in which they're trying to stimulate algal growth. Well, they used light bulbs with the wrong wavelength, and so algae did not grow that well. So again, the point I'm making is that silos in different scientific disciplines in the past, people didn't think, well, maybe I'll ask a phycologist or a biologist that studies algae of what type of light bulbs I should use. And also I want that, the famous bumper stickers in the area in the 60s and 70s of kill the pupfish and save the pupfish. That sentiment is still present. I'll meet people and they find out that I work for the NPS in Devil's Hole, and I had one individual say, drown the pupfish. And I said, well, no, water's good for the fish. All right, switching gear here. So research history. This is a photograph from Brown's room in Devil's Hole. It's a really beautiful place. Not many people have been there. Probably more people have been in space than in Brown's room. So we'll start in the 1960s. The focus was pupfish. So they looked at the morphological characteristics. I like this article by LaRivers, and he calls it the devil pupfish. I've never understood why, but I found that very interesting. They also looked at the behavior of the population and some ecological characteristics. And again, they tried to captively breed the Devil's Hole pupfish with limited to no success. I also wanted to show this. This is a photo of when 3 teenagers learned how to scuba dive in Lake Mead in 1964-65. They came out to Devil's Hole during the day, and a park ranger from Death Valley just happened to show up on that day and said, well, no, you can't do that. So they came back at night. 3 of them entered, 2 surfaced. The most experienced individual put on another tank because their buddy hadn't surfaced yet. That individual went up and never surfaced either. So 2 individuals are still missing, and their dive gear are still missing in Devil's Hole. But the take-home message is you look at all the people, they have this people in the water walking on the shelf, and all of this stuff going on, and the pupfish happen to survive. So 1970s, you can see the shallow shelf is 95% exposed here. Again, it was fish-centric, the studies in the 70s. They looked at the reproductive cycle of the pupfish. They looked at the gut contents of the pupfish, which is a good start to see what the pupfish were consuming. There was also a couple of researchers that looked at water temperature and thermal tolerance of a closely related pupfish. And again, the hydrology and geology of the ecosystem itself was studied. And again, in the 70s, they actually started monitoring of the fish population with the standardized protocol. So this is the early days of diving in Devil's Hole. We have a much more efficient and less disturbing way to access and to dive in Devil's Hole now. But this was back in the 70s with the old dive gear. So how do we count fish? So you can see our new structure in which we have a platform that is suspended above the water surface or above the shelf. And we have 2 teams of divers, a science diver that you can see there in the middle, shining the light on the rocks, counting fish, and then a safety diver above, making sure that the science diver is okay. So when I'm counting fish, I'm really focused on counting fish. And if I get into trouble, I have someone there to help me right away. And we've been following the same protocol now for over 50 years. And concurrently, as the divers descend to a depth of about 100, 110 feet before they turn around and start their counting protocol, we have 3 people on the surface that count fish. And that's just an example of someone from the NPS, Fish and Wildlife, and the Nevada Department of Wildlife. So we move on to the 1980s. It still was a little bit fish-centric. Role of refuges. What was the, how did the refuges do? Did the populations increase? Looking at behavior again in aquaria, a different person this time. Early population models. Also captive breeding attempts at the Steinhardt Aquarium. We see here that spring snails in Ash Meadows and Devil's Hole were first described by Hirschler, Donseda, and Pratt. Okay, moving into the 1990s, the mid-1990s, captive propagation was still continued with very limited success. Gustafson and Deacon looked at the role of DO in the larval distribution of pupfish. Larval are just fish that are less than 12 millimeters. I like to call them baby fish. They also looked at population size related to water level. As we know in the past, the water level went down, the population went down, and then the water levels come back, the pupfish came back. And then there was some other taxonomic work with the resident riffle beetle, Stellimus callida. Well, things changed in the mid-1990s. So along the x-axis, we have year from 1972 on to 2014, and then the population estimate or number of fish via our counting along the y-axis. So the blue line represents the fall count, which is in late September, early October, and the red line reflects our spring count, which is at the end of March to early April. And in 1996, that fall population, as you can see, started to decline precipitously and for unknown reasons. And so what was the reaction by the managing agency? So they reconvened a recovery team that was established back in the 70s. And this was kind of developed an advisory board. And they kind of realized we know more about the fish and not much about the environmental factors or the ecosystem itself. And there was really a lack of funding at the management level. So in the 2000s, there was kind of an expansion away, just not pupfish. They were looking at genetics and expression of the devil's hole pupfish. The community energetics, that's when I became involved in the fall of 1999 through the summer of 2001 when I did my master's with Dr. Dean Blinn from Northern Arizona University. And we looked at the food web and also the carrying capacity, or how many fish can the devil's hole ecosystem support? And what Dean and I calculated was there should be more fish in devil's hole than what they were actually seeing. They also looked at the benthic invertebrate and algal communities, which was really, what type of invertebrates are there as a food source and what types of algae. And they also started to look at another macroinvertebrate, a crustacean, Hyalella. So big change. However, here we have that same figure, time along the x, population size along the y. A little change here. The blue line is our fall count, but the green line is our spring count now. And in the spring of 2006 and 2007, there were 38 observable pupfish. And that was kind of the oh no moment for individuals. I was not here yet, thankfully, but I did have to deal with a lower number 5 years later. So what was the response? The agency coordination was a big deal, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. A decision was made in January of 2007 to supplementally feed the pupfish, so to provide an alternative food source because the fish looked emaciated. The edges of their fins were eroding away. So the MPS, without the blessing of Fish and Wildlife, decided we need to feed. After the fish started to look better, we started seeing a lot more baby fish. The Fish and Wildlife Service got on board. Also, funding became available. The Park Service was able to get funding with a line item request to Congress that started the Devil's Hole program with Death Valley National Park. And that fully was funded in 2007. So, interagency coordination. So the conservation and recovery is managed by 3 agencies, and I've kind of alluded to that. National Park Service, because it's NPS land. Fish and Wildlife, because they oversee the Endangered Species Act. And the Nevada Department of Wildlife, they oversee endangered species in the state of Nevada. So in the early 90s to the mid 90s, the main federal agencies were not seeing eye to eye. Different missions, there were different egos, and so something had to change. So the superintendent at the time of Death Valley National Park, J.T. Reynolds, instituted an incident command team structure. And this is based on the FIRE model. And so basically each agency had a voting member, which is currently the fish biologist for the Park Service, the supervisory biologist out of Las Vegas for fish, and the supervisory biologist for NDOW for Southern Nevada. And then if the ICT cannot come to consensus on a certain recovery or conservation project question, it goes to the management oversight team, which is the superintendent, the regional director, and the chief of fisheries for NDEL, or regional director for fish. So it really helped all of us to start playing nice in the proverbial sandbox to the betterment of the ecosystem and the pupfish. So with that funding, I was hired and came on board in February of 2008. And one of my first tasks was to develop a long-term ecosystem monitoring plan. There was no consistent sampling or monitoring of basic biological, abiotic, and biotic parameters, such as nutrients, the types of macroinvertebrates, algae, how much biomass. And so with that, we developed an ecosystem model. Yes, this is a flow chart, but I just like to point out the boxes or rectangles in yellow. So we're interested in the disturbance effects, the shallow shelf and the deep pool, the role of climate, and also aquifer conditions. This monitoring plan also developed a population model. Of course, we're interested when pupfish eggs are laid, what's their hatching success, the larvae that are produced, do they make it to juveniles and adults, and how fecund or how well do the female and male pupfish produce eggs that are viable. So that kind of gives you an idea. You can see those are real pictures of devil's hole pupfish eggs, larvae, and devil's hole pupfish. So we're going to switch gears now. A recent focus in the last 7-8 years now of the ICT. Most recently, we're working on the Devil's Hole Pupfish Strategic Plan. This is phase 2. So this provides guidelines for management practices, and then also, asking specific applied research questions. And 2 of those that I will discuss briefly is a data synthesis and food web project. So first, we contracted out with Dr. Mark Hausner from the Desert Research Institute to do phase 1, which is basically a review. And that was to look at all of the past management efforts, develop what data and knowledge gaps we have, and looking at the ecological stressors of the ecosystem. With that, we were able to develop a more refined phase 2. So again, guidelines for management practices at Devil's Hole Death Valley National Park. And what we did is we identified, it helps identify and guide management responses. Instead of knee-jerk responses, we have a lot more information now from our monitoring program, some other research, questions that we've done in the past and we kind of set up some crisis scenarios. What conditions, such as DO and temperature changing, and triggers? What was the pupfish population doing? So I'll kind of focus a little bit on our pupfish population trends. So along the bottom there, you'll see our lowest pupfish count of 35 observable fish, which occurred in the spring of 2013. I turned gray overnight, to our highest count that was in the early 1990s of 553, and that was a fall count. And along that, we put, what is the possibility of extinction? Critical, of course, to the lower numbers, moderate high, moderate low to low as we have more fish in Devil's Hole. So we developed kind of an increasing, decrease in static situation based on percent change thresholds. And so again, our pupfish figure with time on the X and population estimate or numbers on the Y. And we looked at what the fall and spring counts were doing over a 3-year period. If there was a certain percentage increase, we would put a green rectangle around it or box, depending. And then if it was static, not much change, it was blue. And if it was declining, it was red. So it kind of gave us a visual representation of what the population over several years was doing. And you can see on the right there, more recently, 10 to 14, 16 years ago, it was, increasing, static, declining. It was a population that was not following normal population trends. So with this, for example, if we had an increasing population, what are some of our options that we outlined in our strategic plan? We could reduce or terminate enhancement actions, such as our supplemental feeding, habitat augmentation. So in the photograph there, you can see some bushes or some terrestrial plants. So we collect some plants from the local vegetation. We weigh them down with rocks, and we initiated that when we saw, pods, not pods, a school of fish that were traveling the shelf, kind of picking up everything in its path. So we wanted to provide vertical structure for smaller fish to hide from the adults. It also provided extra carbon, algae, and other microorganisms would grow on them. Something else, we could look at the translocation of eggs to the Ash Meadows Fish Conservation Facility. So how we get fish from Devil's Hole to the fish facility is that we collect eggs, they bring them in, they treat them, and they rear them to juveniles and adults and then place them into the tank. Something that I'm very interested in, and I hope we get over 300 fish in the fall for a couple of years, we have the ability to do more intrusive research, such as taking fin clip for isotope analysis, looking at the food web again. Also looking at gut content analysis. We have data from the 1960s. I did gut content analysis with fish collected in 2000 and 2001. So almost, a quarter century later, we would like to do that again to see possibly how this ecosystem has changed. Okay, to kind of summarize, this phase 2 is really an adaptive management tool. We will revisit it, and we do on a regular basis. As we gain new scientific information, we can update our triggers and our thresholds. Obviously, we need to use our best available science, and this is kind of, the applied research helps us do that. And also using our basic research. So our long-term ecosystem monitoring plan and program helps inform these thresholds. So applied research and basic research are so important in ecosystem studies and the conservation and recovery of endangered species. Okay, a couple of applied research projects that I would like to talk about. We work obviously with academic institutions. We find funding, one of my main efforts is to find funding both internally with the Park Service, with even Death Valley National Park, and external funding through nonprofits. Maybe the Amargosa Conservancy. So the first project that's kind of wrapping up here now, we called it our data synthesis project. And basically, this is working with Dr. Mark Hausner again from the Desert Research Institute and Dr. John Umack. They used a type of modeling called random forest. And basically, it's machine learning. They, not myself, used all of our data, 10 years of monitoring data, 47 years of scuba counts, 60 plus years of water level data, various synoptic, abiotic, and biotic data like nutrients over many decades. And so we did this because, one of my soapboxes is that if you are doing long-term monitoring, it is critical that you analyze your data, or you're not being informed on the best management actions. The second one is a food web project. So we kind of want to recreate the work that Dean Blinn and I did, 24, 25 years ago. Again, we've been feeding the fish now for 17 years. And so phase 1, we wanted to kind of do a proof of concept. If we could use pupfish eggs versus sacrificing fish or taking fin clips, it turned out that wasn't feasible because we could not collect enough eggs to run an isotopic sample. There's just not enough mass, and they're so small, we would need hundreds of eggs, and that's just not possible, even using a hybrid pupfish. And so we kind of switched gears. We are focusing now more on the role of supplemental food and how has the food web changed both from 25 years ago and possibly due to feeding fish for 17 years. So we're adding carbon food to the ecosystem. So the one question I always ask, do we have a condor of fishes? And so, I hope maybe in my career that we can wean the pupfish off of the supplemental feeding. Okay, we're going to kind of look now at where we are. And so we have what's up with the Devil's Hole pupfish. So our spring count of 2022, you should be familiar now with this figure. So in the spring of 2022, we had 175 observable fish. That's the highest count we had in 22 years in spring. Holy moly, we were excited. Well, we were curious, what was the fall going to produce, or what were we going to see in the fall? So we saw 263 observable pupfish in the fall of 2022. Again, it's the highest in 21 years. So we're like, wow, things are really looking good. Well, we'll go to more recently. Both the spring and fall of 2023 were actually the same. And we can't make those numbers up. We have different divers that count first and second, and different surface counters that just turned out to be the same. But our spring count of this year was 191. And that is the highest count in 25 years, since 1999. That's a quarter century. And for me, it's just amazing. 15 years ago, we thought this species was going extinct. We even had a researcher, Steve Bassinger from UC Berkeley, that did a risk assessment, and his, looking at the possibility of extinction in the future was almost within this 25-year span. He did this, wrote this, and published this in 2013, I want to say. So we're still not out of the woods, but it's looking really good. Okay, so let's summarize what's up with the Devil's Hole pupfish. So recent counts resemble kind of our historic doubling of the population from spring and fall. You might have noticed that. I forgot to point that out, but you did see a gap between spring being lower and fall being higher until more recently into the late 90s, early 2000s. They could be even or one slightly higher than the other. Is this due to the supplemental feeding program? Well, we hope to get a better answer to that with our food web study. And one question we like to ask, are the high spring counts or the higher spring counts than we've had in the past reaching a critical threshold to allow fall counts to increase? So if we're producing a lot more young that are surviving, maybe they have the ability to survive through the fall. And again, we always have that die off through the winter because of the food limitation. So kind of take home messages of my talk today is, if you are doing monitoring, analyze long-term monitoring data, be more informed. Interagency coordination, collaboration is critical for the conservation recovery efforts for Devil's Hole and other endangered species and other ecosystems, if they're rare, if they're threatened. And what really helped was that decision to go to this incident command structure to make decisions. And I like to say, when you're working with multiple agencies, both state, nonprofits, tribes, chuck your mission ego at the door. Do what's best for the ecosystem and the species or species that you're working with. And of course, use best available science in decision making. And you can't have one without the other. Balancing both applied and basic research. In the past 20 years, it's been this, funding from the National Science Foundation doesn't fund basic research. You need to do that on your own. You need to be doing applied research. Well, I'd like to argue sometimes you need to fund basic research so you know what type of applied questions to ask. Again, collaborations, this is not an all-inclusive list. Different universities, different funding sources, nonprofits. The Paxson Ofield Family Foundation provided over $100,000 to the Devil's Hole program. It's the Wrigley Foundation or the Wrigley Fortune. And again, the different state agencies. And with that, we're going to have a little movie time. So hopefully I can end this talk. And Mason, tell me if you're not seeing what I'm trying to show here. Now I can see. Okay, so let me go over here. Can you see this?
Oh, can that's me. Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so here's a flood that we captured with our cameras. And you can see if you look at the top, water coming down. And then at the bottom where the stairs are, you'll start to see overland flow. And it just really increases. It becomes absolutely amazing, the volume of water, how dirty it is. And I'd also like to point up towards the top that it doesn't mix with the deep pool because it's colder and denser. I mean, look at the stairs are covered. It almost comes up to the top of the railings. Here's a different view. And that deep pool is not mixing because of the colder, denser, turbid water. It just drops down. And here are the pupfish reacting to it. They said something's going on. Some of them are kind of taking little bites of the material coming in. You'll see that it's getting cloudy, but I should have pointed out the camera's facing back towards the ladder or our field of view. So it's looking over the shallow shelf from the deep pool. It's getting a little cloudier. I'll fast forward a little bit. Cloudier. It's just amazing. So you can see the amount of organic matter and nutrients that are coming into the ecosystem. It's actually causing the camera housing to move a little bit. Oh, here's a interested fish. Run away. Oh, so they're really inquisitive. That's why they have the name Pupfish, acting like little pupfishes. Okay, 2 more quick videos. Now here is an earthquake, and you have to pay attention early on. You'll see, let me get it, an owl fly up. So it senses something. Hopefully you can all see the owl. It lands on the ladder there. And if you look over at the deep pool and shelf, there's some activity there. The owl kind of flies back, lands on a rock, kind of looks towards the hole. You can see some waves. Okay, owl's interested. What's going on? The owl actually lives up above in some cracks above the opening of Devil's Hole. And when this happens, huge crash. And the owl says, I've had enough. So what's happening is this is an earthquake-induced wave or a sesh, and the pressure of the S&P waves are going through stone, and when they hit water, that energy is released. Then one more video, and this has volume. Some staff were at Devil's Hole to video it live, so you can see up close how the shelf is exposed and how that could impact the pupfish and the eggs and larvae and the other macroinvertebrates and critters. It's like flushing a toilet. I have not been there during a live earthquake. It's on my bucket list. Well, that gives you a sense of, I stop sharing, and oh my God, it's already 6:48. Sorry. I lost track of time. You can tell I talked about Devil's Hole. Well, thank you all for hanging in there for a long, rambling Kevin Wilson and Devil's Hole.
Oh, it's just fantastic, Kevin. I enjoy every opportunity I get like this, just to hear about the history of this species and the habitat. You know, it's for me, I feel like the deeper you go, the more layers you run into, and just the kind of the generations of people now that have been working on this single species and trying to kind of crack the code, so to speak, of like what's it going to take to keep this species from winking out of existence. So I'm deeply grateful for the work you do. I hope everyone enjoyed it. We've got some good questions here in the Q&A feed for you.
Okay, great.
Feel free to add more, folks. You got a little bit of time for that. So the first one is actually in relation to the videos you just shared. When these earthquakes happen, the news actually covers them. That these earthquakes, even in the Pacific, have caused seismic waves to occur in the Devil's Hole. Can you speak more about that? How do we explain that?
Right. So it's hard. I have to pick and choose when I want to talk in detail. So basically, the earthquakes that affect Devil's Hole, it depends on the magnitudes, typically magnitude 6 or higher, and the location. And so the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ring of Fires, typically have the potential of impacting Devil's Hole, such as Mexico, Alaska. I mean, the Ridgecrest earthquakes, they were so large, they created huge waves in Devil's Hole. And some other large ones in Nevada don't. But yeah, it's magnitude, depth, and location kind of on the planet. Back in 2008, the large earthquake in China killed 200,000 people. Devil's Hole did go whoa. So the connectivity gives me goosebumps around the world. It's amazing.
Yeah, and we see this elsewhere in the Amargosa, where you have some kind of tectonic event. You see a spring discharge change, and then it shifts again, and the spring comes back. And I mean, this is kind of happening throughout the region, but obviously we see it so powerfully there. A couple other questions here. One is about the fish in the offsite refuges. Why did they start to change so quickly, do you think?
Right. So, I think basically you should invite Olin and do an Ash Meadows Fish Conservation Facility talk that would kind of wrap up the whole story about what we're doing with our efforts now. But yeah, so these offsite refuges, we call Devil's Hole Light. So they were cooler temperatures, higher oxygen levels, and more consistent food resources throughout the year. Even though they would put covers on them, they would roll these covers to kind of mimic the light or solar radiation in Devil's Hole, it couldn't truly be replicated. It was a smaller habitat. So they would take, say, 15 fish, 20 fish, put them into these refuges and kind of let them do their own thing. So you're going to have high rates of inbreeding, these reduced environmental parameters allow them to get larger, change morphologically. There was a study by Sean Lima that took a different species of pupfish, starved them, put them in warmer temperatures, and they looked more like a Devil's Hole pupfish. Started feeding them more, lowering the temperature, they became the fish that they were. So it's fascinating, that plasticity in the pupfish to different environmental factors.
Gotcha. I'm going to leapfrog to another question on that note of how are the fish related or not related to the other pupfish across the Great Basin? I mean, even in the Amargosa, obviously we have multiple species. So how close or far are those distantly related?
Sure. So the Point of Rocks refuge had wild Devil's Hole pupfish that were placed in them, but two Ash Meadows pupfish happened to get in, 2 or 3, a male and a female. I actually have a note from Fish and Wildlife said they put them in because they were in the outflow. They thought they were Devil's Hole pupfish, but they took over the population. So they're closely related. They can interbreed. And so the Devil's Hole is at the highest elevation spring. It's not a true spring. Some call it a spring pool, but it was isolated the most from the other species. So when times were wetter during the Pleistocene, all the spring heads were kind of connected. You have fewer species. Got drier, spring heads become isolated. We have speciation under different water chemistry, different food availability. And so we see that with the Death Valley fishes, the Owens pupfish, the Shoshone pupfish. We all know the success story of Susan Sorrell's and the Shoshone pupfish. They have up to 8,000 now. They thought they were extinct. The unfortunate extinction of the Tecopa pupfish. So for pupfishes, they're found in northern Mexico. They're found in the Middle East. They're found in the Caribbean islands. They're in Texas. So they're widespread in desert biomes. But Devil's Hole, most of all the other species breed like rabbits. The Devil's Hole pupfish is the anomaly. Just difficult. And Olin Faulbacker with Fish and Wildlife, he cracked that nut in figuring out how to get multiple generations in captivity. So
that's taken
a half century.
Yeah, it's a huge success. It's a huge breakthrough. Yep. It's just got to keep it up.
Hopefully I answered that question. But
yeah. Thanks. There's another question about how you think climate change is going to affect both the environment and the wildlife, in and around the Devil's Hole.
You bet. So Mark Hausner, who he did his PhD at Devil's Hole, was actually one of his committee members. He used fiber optic cables to measure temperature at very, very, very precisely and accurately at very minimal increments in millimeters. And so he developed a thermodynamic model, basically, that modeled. So the southern Mojave Desert has increased 2 degrees Celsius in the last 25 years or so. And so that change in ambient temperature will have an impact on the temperature on the shelf. So that deep pool is always going to be about 93 because of the volume of water. But what we're concerned about is the volume of water over the shelf and that maximum peak temperature from increasing ambient temperature. So right now it's about 35, a peak temperature we see, 35.2. But what happens if it gets up to 36? So yes, we are concerned. In our strategic plan phase 2, we have discussed how are we going to lower temperatures. It will take basically a nuclear reactor because of the volume of water. And, Mark showed with his thermodynamics, when that sun hits the shelf, the sun and that heat blocks movement of water from the deep pool to the shallow shelf. And so that will warm up the shallow shelf. So the volume of water is critical. And again, the floods and the earthquakes deposit, remove. So they're all interconnected. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just seeing it play out in real time in the Amargosa.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. So there's one last question here. I think a really great one to kind of bring us home.
Sure.
From James. So how do we get more people to care about the Devil's Hole pupfish? He says, I've read and heard arguments related to time, money, effort being put into trying to conserve such a tiny fish. How can we be better advocates for the pupfish? And are there other endemic animal and plant species found in the area?
Yes. Let's see. So I do not have my NPS uniform on, so I can talk about the society role. I mean, as a society, we need to decide what is important to us. I have people that come to Devil's Hole and, thank me for what you do. This is incredible. What a neat species. And then I have people go, oh, who cares? You can't eat it. And so for me, it's about education. It's about outreach, a seminar like this, reaching out to local high schools. We invite various universities, environmental law, conservation fish, just trying to get the word out. And that is a Park Service mission. And so, yes, a big part of it is education. And I think with academia, we need to do a better job. I came from academia, and, a lot of people in academia are brilliant, but they have difficulties explaining their research to regular individuals. And so it's getting the word out. And everybody here on this call can do that, or on this, this talk. But yeah, that's society. Put my MPS hat. It's the mission: preserve and protect for future generations. And again, I'm closely associated with the pupfish, but there are many other desert creatures. We have the desert primrose and Eureka. We've got the big dune bug. I mean, there's the 26 endemic species in Ash Meadows itself, and yet they've just got a refuge manager. They have a fish biologist and a maintenance person. So Congress. So we need to talk to our senators in Congress and say, support, fund these important things. Once we lose them, they're gone forever.
Yeah, well said. I mean, the closer we look at this landscape, the more we find. And at last count, I think we're up to over 70 endemic species in the Amargosa watershed. It's staggering. So it remains one of our best opportunities to preserve some, just extraordinarily rare wildlife. And Kevin, you're, on the front lines of that work. So I'm certainly grateful for it. And I hope all the folks here had a great experience. We're out of questions. I think that was a great way to close. So just want to thank Kevin one more time, and then thank everyone for showing up tonight. You could have spent your Thursday night a lot of different ways. We appreciate you spending it with us. And, hopefully we'll see you at another seminar. Yeah.
Yes. Please reach out to me. If you have questions, you need further information, we have educational material if you would like that. Mason has my contact information. But thank you for coming out and supporting the Amargosa Conservancy, and Mason, for what you do. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Everyone have a great night. We'll send out an email with the recording and everything afterwards.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
End.